Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is John Cole, aka Cybertail, coming at you with all things chess. We're continuing our examination of hanging pawns. We're going back to another classic today. This is Svetozar Gligoric against Gligoric-Keres. Both two legends that never got the world title. Keres was, of course, much closer to the world title. With some better luck and one or two candidates, you could easily imagine Keres finally winning the title outright. Gligoric never got super close, but he was always a very strong grandmaster. And he was a strong grandmaster at a time when it was an active detriment to not be a Soviet player. It was just incredibly difficult to be a strong chess player in the West. He was part of that class of players with Reshevsky, Najdorf, and others that very strong grandmasters, but they just didn't have the resources or support to make the most of their talents. But Gligoric was white here, Keres was black. D4, E6, bishop B4, Nimzo Indian, E3, the Rubinstein. This is probably the most reliable response to the Nimzo Indian. C5, this is sort of an older move. This used to be extraordinarily popular, especially in the 70s and 80s, to get to an opening line that we'll look at here in a bit. Modern theory isn't so keen on C5 anymore. It's still seen, but it's not nearly as popular as it used to be. Bishop D3, that's not the reason that's no longer popular. Whoop. Knight G2, or Knight E2 is the popular reason why this move is no longer popular. In general, Knight E2 is the Reshevsky line and the Rubinstein. Of course, White's idea is that he's going to recapture on C3 so he doesn't have to experience double pawns. Here it's especially strong because once White plays A3, that dark square bishop is going to be forced to take, the knight will take back, and then that pawn on C5 will be fairly tender. And Black will have to sort of clarify issues in the center. Pretty much all these lines end up with at least a slight advantage for White. Modern theory has worked out all of these to be at least a little bit more comfortable for White. Not completely unplayable, but it just sort of puts Black behind the ball to begin with, so Black's gravitated towards other moves like Castle is the main modern approach. If you want to be aggressive, B6 is pretty popular. Yeah, bishop D3, this just leads to a normal position. B6, it's a somewhat rare move, but it's completely logical. The really popular line in the 70s and 80s, knight C6. And this reaches what's called the Hübner variation. This was actually Nimzovich's original concept for the Nimzo Indian. But with this specific move order, it never caught on until Robert Hübner, a very strong grandmaster from West Germany, popularized this in the 70s and 80s. This was his original concept of it because Black hasn't castled yet. In some lines, Black will actually either castle queenside or just manually walk his king over to the queenside, where things are completely closed up over there. Very solid. This is an excellent version of the Hübner. Because C5 has sort of fallen off, the modern way of reaching the Hübner, I'll just demonstrate that real quick. Castle. Now D6. And this is the modern way of reaching the Hübner variation. Your king is committed to the kingside, so you don't get those lines where Black king goes queenside. But generally, this is still quite solid for Black. But yeah, B6, perfectly good move. It's putting the light square bishop to work for the fight for the key E4 square, which is always the most important square in the Nimzo Indian. So this makes complete sense. F3, bishop B7, bishop D2. This isn't terrible. But it's a little bit passive. It's always good to develop your pieces, but by moving your bishop to d2, the bishop's not doing anything that it wasn't already doing. It's just sort of development in name only. The most popular modern move is knight a4 here. And this truly is concrete chess. The knight's going to the side of the board, which, according to Mr. Siegbert, isn't the greatest choice, but it has a specific purpose. We're going to kick that dark square bishop away, and then the c-pawn will be hanging. That's it, very concrete chess. So Black has to come up with a good way to face this. Most popular way, take. And this will be a very interesting struggle. White's managed to gain some valuable queenside space. He'll continue with that. He'll move his knight back to c3 and start moving his queenside pawns more. The cost of that, of course, is the time that he's spent moving his knight, to c3 to a4, and then he'll move the knight back to c3. Counter argument, at least for me, would be the bishops drop back to b4 and then all the way back to f8. And it's not like the rook moving to e8 is especially productive. Actually, I like White's position here. White actually scores pretty well from here. Or actually, the reverse of that. Black scores pretty well from here. But the engine says that this is a slight advantage for White, which I sort of believe over the performance score. But very interesting position. Bishop d2 isn't terrible, but it's pretty passive. It just doesn't really accomplish anything. It prevents the double pawns, but that's about it. So Black chooses a great time to transition structures, so he takes on d4. And then d5. And this is a truly excellent play. We're transitioning to an isolated queen-pawn structure once this bishop has committed itself to d2, because that's a very passive post for the dark square bishop in an isolated queen-pawn structure. So excellent choice from Keres. cxd, bishop x c3. This is actually a serious strategic error. This takes it from being about even, slightly better for Black, to, I would say, much better for Whites. And this is the real strategic complexity in trying to assess these hanging pawns versus isolated pawn structures, that knowing when to transition to which structure. Here, sort of all the earmarks are telling us that it's better to go to an isolated queen pawn. Black's position is ideal to go up against isolated queen pawn. His light square bishop is already solved. If his bishop were still sitting on c8, that might be a mark against going to an isolated queen pawn. But here, the bishop's on a beautiful diagonal. None of White's pieces are especially dangerously posted for an isolated queen pawn. As we said, the bishop on d2 is a very passive piece for an isolated queen pawn structure. The white knight isn't on e5. The bishop, it's okay, but White's going to have to spend some more time to set up that battery against the queen and bishop battery against the h7 pawn. So this is sort of a mnemonic device for us to sort of look towards going to an isolated queen pawn structure. Best move would be knight x d5, then bishop x d2. Of course, if White just chooses a routine move, I would say this is outright better for Black. This is a dream isolated queen pawn structure for Black. He's managed to get 2 minor pieces off the board. There's no hint of attack for Whites. This is very favorable for Black. So the one choice that White has to destabilize things, knight x b6. But then Black gets the pawn back immediately. If White tries to keep the pawn, his position just ripped to shreds. And here, I really like rook a5. That's the rook lift to either come to d5 to get that pawn, or to h5 to start an attack against the kingside. Black is outright better here. This White's up a pawn, but the extra pawn, at the very least, will drop off quite soon. But if White doesn't destabilize, this is just a very decent and almost favorable position for Black. Whereas this is a major strategic mistake from Black in going to a hanging pawn structure. This gives White all the trumps. So to begin with, he's giving up the bishop pair. That's always a big deal in an open position like this. But we'll see what other factors come up. First off, note, bishop x c3, there's no reason to play this. After knight x d5, the knight on d5 is an extraordinarily strong piece, whereas by transitioning to the hanging pawn structure, White gets a measure of control over the d5 square. There's no outpost square for Black to use. So queen x d5, c4, rook e1's another alternative, but c4 is perfectly fine as well. And then bishop c3. This is why this was such a bad time to transition to a hanging pawn structure for Black, because this is an optimal position for White. These bishops, White has the bishop pair, and these bishops are very well posted. On c3 and d3, they're just raking towards the king side. As soon as White can favorably set up d5, those bishops are going to be annihilating the king side. Black just doesn't have any play just yet. He doesn't have any pressure going against the hanging pawns. When you're transitioning to a hanging pawn structure, you want to either make sure that c4 cannot be achieved, or you want immediate pressure against those pawns. Failing those two conditions, you should really think twice about heading to hanging pawn structure, because in so many of these positions, it just leads to a very favorable outcome. You know, the hanging pawns control a central space, there's a d5 break. A lot of times with the hanging pawns, the side will have the bishop pair. This is a very nice position for white. This is ideal, and Gligoric does a good job of showing the attacking potential. So knight bd7. Bishop e4 is probably more thematic. In general, when you're facing the bishop pair, but especially when you're going up against a hanging pawn structure, you want to try to neutralize one of these bishops. You don't want to leave the bishop pair intact to rampage across the board. So bishop e4 looks to at least neutralize the light squared bishop. So white keeps it on the board. Knight d2, and that's another nice part about bishop e4 is it forces the knight to go back to d2, which is a little bit more passive. White is still very comfortable here. You know, let's now, of course, black will maybe black would play bishop g6. I need to analyze it deeper, but maybe bishop g6 is okay here to help shore up the kingside. But this to me looks like a very comfortable position for white. He's got the bishop pair. You do have these theoretical weaknesses of the hanging pawns, but one thematic option here, and I'm not sure it's the best move here outright. I'm just putting it on the board so we can look at it. One thematic option for the hanging pawns in these structures when b6 is on the board, or b3 conversely, is to play a4, to play the a pawn up. Your plan is to play a5 to create a target on the king side. So even in these positions, or to create a target on the queen side, even in these positions, the side with the hanging pawns isn't locked into just a king side attack. With the a4, a5 thrust, you can generate a target on the queen side and go for queen side play. So these hanging pawns positions are still very flexible. There's a whole wealth of ideas to work with. But bishop e4, in my opinion, is better. You want to try to neutralize one of the bishops when you're going up against the bishop pair. Knight bd7, it's not necessarily bad, just not assertive. Rook e1, so that's just the logical place for the rook, and it helps look out for the e5 break, which is sort of a key break in these hanging pawns if this defending side can achieve it. Rook a8, this is just too passive. We don't have any pressure against the c pawn, so putting a rook on the c file doesn't accomplish anything. Queen f4 is a better choice. This is, against the hanging pawns, when you have a bishop on b7, this is a thematic continuation to try to generate counterplay. Again, this is sort of the broken record, but with every position, you want to defend actively. Don't defend passively. If you defend passively in the face of someone building up for an attack, you're just going to get rolled over every time against a competent opponent. You want to be playing aggressively and gain your own counterplay. Of course, black's threat here is to just to take on f3 and just completely demolish white's structure. Bishop d2, queen d6. The bishop really belongs on c3, so it moves back, then queen f4 again. So this would be a way that black can at least get the queens off the board. And I think white is still slightly better here. He's got the bishop pair. He's got the a4, a5 plan. But with the queens off the board, at least black doesn't have to worry about a savage maiden attack rolling over him. He has a chance to get his pieces mobilized and try to get counterplay against probably the c pawn most of all. But rook a8 is just far too routine and allows white to continue to build. h3. This is a useful move. It stops some random knight g4 tactics. It's sort of a mnemonic device, tactically. Whenever you have a bishop on b7 and a queen controlling the b8 to h2 diagonal like this, a lot of times knight g4 will be a tactical resource. So then bishop x3, then you can take on h2. So h2 just sort of cuts that out. d8, rook e3. So rook lifts are also a theme in these hanging pawns, not just an isolated pawn. So the rook here comes to e3 to solidify the bishop on d3, because in some situations, I'm not saying it's a good move here, but knight c5 is a possible tactical resource for black in some of these positions. So rook e3 defends that bishop on d3 to cut that out. But of course, once the knight moves away from the f3 square, the rook can lift to g3 and be a part of the kingside attack. Also, it makes way for the other rook. You know, the queen can come to e2, and then the rook can come to e1, and then all of white's pieces are completely involved in the kingside build. So, excellent move from Gligoric. Knight h5. Black's position is quite poor. It's very passive. But this completely gives it away. This is a decisive mistake. Knight f8 is passive, but it's necessary. In so many of these positions against the hanging pawns, a knight on either f1 or f8, we saw this with our Nimzovich-Tarrasch game, that knight on f1 or f8 is going to help shore up the king side and keep the other side alive. So knight f8 is pretty much mandatory here for black. And this is just one potential line from whites. So knight h5, the idea is to route the knight to f4. Here, black has found a very solid way to route his knight to f4. You know, it's taking the f8 to g6 to f4 route, keeping the king side shored up. White is still much better here. White's got the bishop pair. He's got a very aggressive position. He can always kick that knight away from f4. The knight's going to hop to e5. That's very natural. But black is still solid, and white still has to find the moves to convert. Whereas after knight h5, white actually has two ways of converting here. d5. This is the thematic hanging pawn choice. It's not the most incisive, though. Bishop xf7. This should be any tactical player. The bishop h7, the Greek sacrifice, needs to be a part of your database. And here it's completely decisive for white. This is pretty much forced. And then h4. This is a lovely little quiet move. We defend the knight on g5, and now either queen b1 or queen d3 check is completely decisive. Knight f4 looks to stop it, but then rook g3, just looking right at the black king, and this is over. One potential line is this. And this is just a decisive position for white. Black doesn't have enough material for the queen, and the mating attack is going to continue anyways. So bishop h7, thematic tactic here. This is something to always be on the lookout for. d5 is sort of the thematic hanging pawn break. It completely unleashes both of white's bishops against the black king side. But bishop h7 was a better choice. Knight c5. This is moving a piece away from the king side at a time when you can't afford defenders. g6 was necessary here. Black's position is completely miserable, but he's not yet done. You know, white still has to find the moves to convert. But knight c5 moves a piece away. Knight g5 here, again, bishop h7 was also decisive here. And here, white actually has a little bit different resource. He has takes on f7. And then here, a pretty shot with bishop xg7. Just continuing the denouement. All of these pieces have nothing to do with the king side. The king side is all that matters here. And white has a decisive advantage here. Queen and 3 pawns and continuing mating attack completely outweigh the rook and the 2 minors. So knight g5 is still fine, but Gligoric wasn't nearly as incisive here as he could have been. Bishop h7 was a more incisive move. g6, bishop e2. So it's hitting the knight on h5 and making way for queen to d4. Just like in isolated queen pawns, once you're able to encourage g6, you can work against those dark squares, but in the hanging pawns version, it's even more incisive for white, because that bishop, after the d5 break, has that commanding diagonal. Whereas in the isolated queen pawn version, that bishop would be maybe on h6 or g5, not on this gorgeous long diagonal. Queen d4, queen f8's forced. Bishop g4, this is fine. Again, Gligoric isn't nearly as incisive as he could have been. Bishop xg6 is completely decisive. One gorgeous line. Knight f5. Bishop xg6. And this really is a gorgeous tactic. Knight xh4. That is checkmate. Boys and girls, that's why they play the game. But yeah, the bishop h5 is just completely crushing sacrifice. And it's completely justified. When you go back and look at this position, all of white's pieces are completely primed for the attack. All of black's pieces are stuck over here on the queen side, not defending. When you're in this situation, all your pieces are optimally placed, it's time to open up the position. It's time to look for those sacrifices to open up your way to the enemy king. White here is completely justified in playing bishop h5. Bishop g4 is fine, but it's not nearly as incisive. f5, not the best, but this is going for black anyways. Queen g5 is a little bit more accurate, and this is a much more aesthetic way of finishing up, but bishop h5 is also fine. f4, Keres, of course, saw the mates. This is just a gentleman allowing his opponent a chance to checkmate and finish the game honorably. So Keres was known for his incredible sportsmanship and Very gentle demeanor. He was a real gentleman the entire time. And especially when you read about his life, how he was on the verge of perhaps being put in a gulag after World War II. His home country of Estonia was taken over by the Soviets and the Nazis. He had a right to be a lot more bitter towards life than he was, but he was always a real gentleman. So kudos to Keres for choosing an honorable finish for his opponent. So good game from Gligoric. It wasn't nearly as incisive as it could have been. The real instructional meat for this that I want you to take away is this moment here. And definitely look at the game notes to take a look at it. This moment where you're choosing when to transfer from an isolated queen pawn to hanging pawn is absolutely key. And in making that determination, it involves a lot of factors. You want to look at the minor pieces. Here, white's minor pieces aren't optimally placed for an isolated queen pawn. That bishop on d2 doesn't make sense for an isolated queen pawn. It makes sense for a hanging pawn, because then it can hop to c3 as it does in the game. But not for an isolated queen pawn. You want to think about transferring to an hanging pawn structure if you can prevent the c-pawn from moving. Here, it moves to c4 immediately, so the hanging pawns aren't vulnerable. They're immediately taking up central space. So the real tragedy of this game is that Keres chose the absolute wrong time to transition to a hanging pawn structure. After that, white just gained a very aggressive position. It would have been difficult for a lot of players to defend this position, honestly, because this is such a nice position for white. The real chance for black here was after queen f4. At least try to get the queens off the board, or earlier, try to challenge at least one of the bishop pair. You don't want to leave the bishop pair just unopposed on the board, wrecking your position. But as usual, passive defense just never does the job well. And then this thematic break with d5. When you have the hanging pawns, d5 is the pawn break you constantly want to be looking at. Here, everything is perfectly arranged for it. Both those bishops are perfectly lined up at the king side. White's got his rook on e3, ready to transition to the attack. After queen e2, this other rook is ready to hop into the game. Everything is set up for this d5 sacrificial push. Now, it happens to be that there's a better sacrifice here. But that's almost a tactical accident. I really want you to come away with this looking at this d4, d5, because this move is so thematic for these hanging pawn structures. It's just sort of often ends up being the entire engine for the hanging pawn's play against the enemy king side. That's just a move you want to have in your database, constantly looking at once it's properly prepared. So, beautiful game. As usual, I'll have the annotated game notes in the comments, so take a look at that. We'll continue our examination later. My name's John. I'll catch you later.